The old woman almost didn't open the door. The storm was brutal. The night was dangerous. And at her age, stepping outside in that cold could have been fatal. But then she heard it. A weak scratching, followed by a sound so small and broken, it barely counted as a cry. When she opened the door, 2 dogs collapsed onto her porch, frozen, bleeding, their bodies shaking uncontrollably. They had been running for miles, hiding from something. Abandoned in a storm meant to kill them, she took them in. Without asking questions, she had no idea one was. Trained to protect lives, she had no idea the other had. Survived the crime scene, and she had no idea that by morning, police helicopters, K9 units, and armed officers would surround her home, because those weren't just dogs, they were evidence, and the woman who saved them had just walked into the middle of a case the police had been desperately searching for. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The cabin sat alone at the edge of the forest, where the road ended and the world seemed to forget anyone lived there. Snow had buried the porch steps days ago, piling high against the thick wooden walls like nature itself was trying to seal the place shut. No neighbors. No passing cars. Inside lived Eleanor, a woman well into her 70s, with silver hair pulled neatly back and hands rough from years of surviving on her own. Her husband had passed a decade earlier, and her children had long since moved to cities she no longer recognized. The cabin was all she had left, and she guarded it fiercely, just as it had protected her through countless winters. That night, the cold was different. It pressed against the windows with a cruel persistence, slipping through cracks, creeping into her bones. Eleanor fed another log into the fireplace, watching the flames dance, listening to the wind howl like something alive. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and whispered a quiet prayer that the storm would pass by morning. She was used to silence. It had become her companion. The forest beyond the glass was still, too still, as if every creature had vanished or was hiding from something unseen. Eleanor shuffled toward her armchair, lowering herself slowly, joints aching as she exhaled. She reached for her knitting needles, trying to distract herself, when a sudden gust rattled the door hard enough to make her flinch. She paused, listened. The wind screamed again, rattling the walls, but beneath it, faint and uncertain, was another sound. Not the wind. Something closer, something at her door. At first, Eleanor told herself it was nothing. Winter played tricks on the mind, especially when you lived alone long enough. The cabin groaned as it always did when the temperature dropped too fast. She sat still in her chair, knitting needles frozen between her fingers, waiting for the sound to fade. It didn't. A faint thump echoed again, soft, uneven, almost apologetic. Eleanor's heart began to pound. No one ever came this far out, not in weather like this. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the road had been buried since the storm began. She stood slowly, her breath shallow now, and leaned closer to the door, listening. "Hello?" she called, her voice thin and unsure. There was no answer, only another weak sound, closer to the ground this time. Eleanor's gaze dropped to the bottom of the door, where snow had blown in through the cracks. Something was out there. Something small. Something struggling. She hesitated. Opening the door meant letting the cold inside, meant risking a fall, or worse. At her age, a single mistake could cost her everything. Then she heard it. Whimper. So faint, it could have been mistaken for the wind if it hadn't carried pain in it. Eleanor swallowed hard. She pulled the door open just a few inches, bracing herself as icy air exploded into the room. 2 dark shapes lay collapsed on the porch, half buried in snow. They barely moved. Eleanor gasped. They were dogs, young, soaked, shaking violently, their bodies pressed together for warmth that wasn't enough. One lifted its head weakly, eyes cloudy, pleading, then dropped it again. Without another thought, Eleanor flung the door wide open. "Come on," she whispered, tears forming. "You're safe now." And in that moment, she didn't realize she had just changed everything. The cold rushed in like a living thing as Eleanor dragged the dogs inside, the wind snapping at her heels before she slammed the door shut. The two dogs lay on the floor, their bodies trembling so violently the boards beneath them seemed to shake. Their breathing was shallow, uneven, frighteningly slow. Eleanor dropped to her knees despite the pain in her joints, pressing her palms against their sides. Their paws were cracked and raw, pads torn and bleeding. She sucked in a sharp breath, fighting the urge to panic. Panic would waste time, and time was something they didn't have. "Easy now," she murmured, her voice shaking as much as they were. Slowly, gently, she fetched old quilts from the bedroom, thick and heavy, and wrapped them around the dogs one by one. Careful not to shock their frozen bodies with too much heat, she set a kettle on the stove and waited, counting each second by the beat of her heart. The dogs whimpered softly but didn't pull away. They trusted her. Hours slipped by unnoticed. Eleanor sat on the floor beside them, feeding them small sips of warm milk from a spoon, whispering encouragement with every breath they took. Outside, the storm howled, but inside the cabin, a fragile battle was being fought. And somewhere deep down, Eleanor knew the night wasn't over yet. As the fire burned lower and the storm outside began to ease, Eleanor noticed something that made her pause. The dogs were no longer trembling as violently, but they weren't relaxing either. Instead, they lay alert beneath the blankets, ears twitching at every sound, eyes tracking the room with quiet focus. It wasn't the behavior of frightened strays. It was controlled, watchful. When Eleanor rose to fetch more wood, one of the dogs lifted its head instantly. The other followed, pushing itself upright despite the pain. Neither barked. Neither whimpered. They simply watched her calm, assessing, as if measuring her every move. She stopped mid-step, unsettled by the intensity of their gaze. "It's all right," she said softly, raising her hands without thinking. The words felt strange on her tongue, like something she'd said long ago. To her surprise, both dogs eased back down, their bodies relaxing slightly at the sound of her voice. Obedience, not fear. Later, when a branch cracked outside, both dogs moved at once. One shifted closer to Eleanor's chair, positioning its body between her and the door. The other turned toward the entrance, muscles tensing beneath its fur. No barking, no chaos, just readiness. Eleanor's heart skipped. She had raised farm dogs once. She knew the difference. These dogs weren't lost. They weren't wild. They were trained. She noticed the markings next. Faded scars beneath their fur. A worn patch on one dog's neck where a collar had rubbed for years. The other had a thin cut along its side, clean and straight. Not from the forest, but from something sharp. The realization settled slowly, heavily. These aren't just dogs, she whispered to herself. The night refused to let go of her. Eleanor sat awake in her armchair, the dogs resting on blankets near the fire, their sides rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. Every time the log shifted or the wind brushed against the walls, her eyes snapped open, her heart racing. Sleep never came, not fully. Not when two fragile lives depended on her staying alert. She thought of her husband then, of how he used to say winter showed people who they really were. He'd laugh, pull her closer, promise she'd never face the cold alone. The memory tightened her chest. She reached down and rested her hand on the nearer dog's back, feeling warmth at last beneath her palm. The dog didn't flinch. Instead, it leaned into her touch just slightly, as if drawing strength from it. The other dog lifted its head, watching her with calm, intelligent eyes before settling again. Eleanor swallowed hard. She had rescued them, but somehow, it felt like they were watching over her too. Hours dragged by. She fed the fire again. Checked their paws. Counted breaths. Outside, the storm finally began to weaken, snow falling softer now, the wind losing its fury. The cabin creaked and sighed as if relieved. Near dawn, Eleanor's eyelids grew heavy. She nodded forward, only to jolt awake at a distant sound. Sirens? No, just the echo of wind along the valley. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to relax. The dogs stirred at the same moment, both lifting their heads, ears pricking toward the darkness beyond the door. They didn't growl. They didn't bark. They listened. Eleanor followed their gaze, unease settling in her stomach. Whatever they sensed wasn't the storm. Morning light crept through the frost-coated windows, pale and unfamiliar. Eleanor woke with a stiff neck and aching bones, disoriented for a moment before memory rushed back. The dogs. She pushed herself upright, heart skipping as she looked toward the fire. They were still there. Both dogs lay awake, alert, their bodies stronger now but tense, as if they'd been waiting. Relief washed over her, quickly followed by confusion when a distant sound cut through the quiet. A low wail. Eleanor frowned, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, sharper, unmistakable now. Sirens. Her heart began to race. No one came out here. Not ambulances. Not police. She moved toward the window and pulled the curtain back an inch. Red and blue lights flashed against the snow, painting the trees in violent color. Her breath caught. Police vehicles lined the road she hadn't seen cleared in weeks. Officers stepped out, bundled in dark coats, spreading across the property with careful precision. One raised a hand, signaling the others to slow. What on earth? Eleanor whispered, panic creeping into her chest. Behind her, the dogs rose to their feet in perfect unison. One moved closer to her, pressing against her leg. The other turned toward the door, head low, eyes sharp. They weren't afraid. They were ready. A loud knock shook the door, firm and authoritative. "Ma'am," a voice called from outside, amplified through a speaker. "This is the police. Please come to the door." Eleanor's hands trembled. She looked down at the dogs, searching their faces for answers she didn't have. "I only helped them," she whispered, her voice breaking, and as the sirens continued to wail outside, Eleanor realized her quiet act of kindness had led something powerful straight to her. Doorstep. Eleanor stood frozen in the middle of the cabin, her breath shallow, the knock still echoing through the walls. The dogs remained at her sides, bodies rigid, eyes locked on the door. One pressed closer to her leg, steady and protective. The other stood squarely between her and the entrance, shoulders tense, ready. "Ma'am, please step outside where we can see you," the voice called again, calm but firm. Her mind raced. Had she done something wrong? Had helping those dogs somehow broken a law she didn't know existed? Her hands shook as she pulled her shawl tighter, the cold suddenly forgotten beneath a rising wave of fear. I'm coming," she called back, her voice barely steady. She reached for the door slowly. The dogs reacted instantly. One let out a low, restrained growl, not aggressive, but warning. Eleanor paused and rested her hand on its head, meeting its gaze. "It's all right," she whispered. "I won't leave you." The growl stopped. Eleanor opened the door. Cold air rushed in again, but this time it carried the weight of authority. Officers stood across the yard, spaced carefully, hands resting near their belts. Snow crunched under their boots. Red and blue lights reflected off the cabin walls like flashing alarms. "Please keep your hands visible," an officer instructed. Eleanor lifted them, palms out, heart hammering. She took one step onto the porch. Behind her, the dogs followed to the threshold, standing tall and focused. Several officers stiffened. "Sir." "Look at the dogs," one muttered under his breath. Eleanor turned slightly, confused. The dogs weren't barking. They weren't lunging. They were holding position. The moment one of the officers took a cautious step forward, both dogs responded. Not with chaos. Not with fear. They moved with precision, one shifting slightly to Eleanor's side, the other angling its body toward the approaching officer. Their movements were sharp, deliberate, practiced. Hold, the officer said instinctively, raising a hand to his team. The dog stopped instantly. No bark. No snarl, just stillness. A ripple of disbelief moved through the line of officers. Eleanor felt it too, a sudden tightening in her chest. She hadn't taught them that. No one had. And yet they obeyed a command they shouldn't have recognized. Did you see that? Another officer whispered. One of the dogs lowered itself into a sit, eyes fixed forward, waiting. The other remained standing, ears forward, scanning the area like it was counting exits, assessing angles. It was no longer protecting just Eleanor, it was working. A senior officer stepped closer, his voice steady but cautious. "Ma'am," he said, eyes never leaving the dogs, "have these animals been trained?" Eleanor shook her head slowly. I found them freezing on my porch last night. I just helped them." The man exhaled through his teeth, something like awe crossing his face. He gave a short hand signal. 2 K9 handlers moved forward from behind the cruisers, their posture instantly different, professional, alert. One handler knelt slightly and spoke a single word. "Heel." Both dogs reacted at once. They snapped into position beside Eleanor, sitting tall, focused. Disciplined. Silence fell across the yard. No one spoke, because in that moment, everyone understood the same thing. These weren't strays. They were highly trained police dogs, and they had chosen to protect her. The senior officer lowered his radio slowly, eyes never leaving the two dogs. His expression shifted from caution to something closer to disbelief. "Everyone, stand down," he said quietly. "These dogs aren't a threat." Eleanor felt her knees weaken with relief, but confusion rushed in just as fast. "If they're not, then why are you here?" she asked, her voice trembling despite herself. One of the K9 handlers stepped closer, removing his hat as a sign of respect. "Ma'am," he said gently, "these dogs have been missing for 3 days." Her breath caught. "They're active police K9 South," he continued. "Partners. Trained for tracking, protection, and detection. They disappeared during a transport after a high-risk arrest." Another officer pulled out a tablet, showing images of the same two dogs, clean, strong, wearing official K9 harnesses. Beneath the photos flashed a statewide alert. "Stolen K9 units. Considered in danger." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. "They were taken by someone who didn't want witnesses," the handler said, jaw tight. "When the suspect realized he couldn't control them, he dumped them in the storm. Left to die." The words weren't spoken, but they hung heavy in the cold air. Eleanor looked down at the dogs, remembering their bleeding paws, their shaking bodies on her porch. Her chest tightened painfully. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear, I didn't know." The handler knelt in front of the dogs, voice breaking as he called their names. One dog's tail moved slightly. The other leaned forward, sniffing, then paused, eyes flicking back toward Eleanor, for a brief moment. Neither dog moved. They had been abandoned once, and now they were choosing, and somehow, Eleanor understood the night she saved them hadn't just spared their lives, it had earned their loyalty. The senior officer stepped away from the line of cruisers and approached Eleanor slowly. His posture finally relaxed. "Ma'am," he said, lowering his voice, "we didn't know who we were walking into this morning. And for that, I'm sorry." Eleanor hugged her shawl tighter around herself. "I thought I'd done something wrong," she admitted, her voice thin. "I only tried to help them." "You did more than that," he replied. "You saved them." He gestured toward a technician standing near one of the vehicles. "One of the dogs has a GPS tracking chip embedded near the shoulder," he explained. It went silent for hours. Then just before dawn, it pinged again from this location. Every eye had turned toward her cabin. We feared the suspect might be here, the officer continued. Armed, dangerous. We didn't know if the dogs were being held or used. Eleanor's knees nearly gave way. The thought of armed criminals, of danger so close to her quiet home, made her stomach twist. I had no idea, she whispered. That's why we surrounded the property, he said gently. We expected resistance. Instead, they found an elderly woman with a fireplace, blankets on the floor, and two injured heroes sleeping beside her. Behind them, the dogs shifted. One leaned against Eleanor's leg again, solid and steady. The other watched the officers, calm now, trusting the tension had passed. The senior officer removed his gloves. What you did last night, he said, changed everything. Those dogs survived because of you. Eleanor felt tears spill down her cheeks, not from fear this time, but from the weight of it all finally settling in. Her small act of kindness hadn't brought danger to her door, that it had brought the truth. The words finally broke her. Eleanor's knees buckled, and she sank onto the porch step, the cold wood seeping through her coat. Her hands covered her face as quiet sobs shook her shoulders. All the fear she had held back through the night, every moment of doubt, every whispered prayer came crashing out at once. I thought. Her voice cracked as she tried to speak. I thought I'd made things worse. That I'd done something wrong. An officer immediately stepped forward and knelt beside her, keeping his voice soft. No, ma'am, he said firmly. You did exactly what anyone hoped someone would do. The dogs reacted instantly. One pressed its body against her side, offering warmth and steady pressure. The other lowered its head onto her knee, eyes calm, unwavering. Eleanor felt their weight, their presence anchoring her back to the moment. She laughed weakly through tears. You stayed with me all night, she whispered to them. Didn't you? The handler watched quietly, emotion tightening his throat. He had trained those dogs for years, but he had never seen them like this. Not off duty. Not choosing comfort over command. One of the dogs let out a soft huff and nudged Eleanor's hand upward, demanding touch. She smiled through tears and obliged, stroking its fur slowly. For the first time since the sirens arrived, Eleanor felt safe. And for the first time since they were abandoned. So did the dogs. Both lifted their heads for a heartbeat. No one breathed. Easy, boy, one handler said softly, his voice thick with emotion as he took a careful step forward. It's me. The dogs froze, caught between instinct and memory. Their tails twitched, uncertain. One took a hesitant step forward, then stopped, eyes flicking back to Eleanor. As if asking permission, Eleanor nodded gently. Her throat too tight for words. That was all it took. The dogs surged forward, whining now, pressing into their handlers with sudden force. Hands buried into fur. Faces pressed down into warm necks. One of the men turned away quickly, dragging a sleeve across his eyes. I thought we lost you, he whispered, his voice breaking. But even as the reunion unfolded, something unexpected happened. One dog pulled back. It returned to Eleanor's side and sat down, leaning against her leg, refusing to move. The handler blinked, surprised. Hey, come on, buddy. The dog didn't. The vet who had arrived with the unit knelt nearby, observing quietly. They've bonded, she said. Trauma does that. When survival is shared, loyalty deepens. The handler nodded slowly, understanding settling in. He looked at Eleanor with a mixture of gratitude and awe. You kept them alive, he said. They won't forget that. Eleanor reached down, her hand trembling slightly, and rested it on the dog's head. I won't either, she whispered. The snow crunched softly under boots as the officers began to relax. Radios lowering, tension finally easing from their shoulders. Plans were being made, transport arrangements, medical checks, paperwork. Everything was moving forward the way it should have from the start. Except for one thing. One of the dogs still hadn't moved. It sat pressed firmly against Eleanor's leg. Its body warm and solid, eyes calm but resolute. When a handler approached with a leash, the dog didn't growl or resist. It simply stayed where it was, leaning closer to her, as if anchoring itself in place. The handler stopped, confused. "That's not like him," he said quietly. "He's never refused a command." The vet watched carefully, then nodded with understanding. "He's not disobeying," she said. "He's choosing." Eleanor's breath caught. "I don't want to take him from you," she said quickly, fear flashing across her face. "I know he belongs with you." You didn't take anything," the handler interrupted gently. "You gave him something." The dog lifted its head and looked up at Eleanor, eyes soft, trusting. She felt tears return, her hand instinctively stroking behind his ears. "I just didn't want him to feel alone," she whispered. The vet crouched beside them. "We'll take them for treatment," she explained. "But for now, letting him stay close might help stabilize him. Trauma bonding can be powerful." The handler hesitated only a moment before nodding. "All right," he said. "A few more minutes." Eleanor let out a shaky breath, relief washing through her. The dog settled even more comfortably at her side, content. As if the decision had already been made long before anyone asked. The town gathered 2 weeks later. Long after the snow had melted from Eleanor's porch and the fear had faded into memory. She stood near the front of the small community hall, hands folded. Unsure why so many people had come just to see her, she didn't feel like a hero. The police chief stepped forward, clearing his throat before speaking. "This woman," he said, gesturing toward Eleanor, "did what training and equipment couldn't. She saved 2 of our finest partners with nothing but compassion." Applause filled the room, loud and unrestrained. Eleanor's cheeks flushed as she looked down, overwhelmed. She had spent her life doing quiet things, raising children, tending gardens, surviving winters. She never expected to be thanked for kindness. An officer handed her a framed certificate. Another presented an envelope, explaining softly that the department and community had covered the dog's medical bills and more. There would be help with heating costs, repairs to the cabin roof, groceries delivered all winter. Eleanor shook her head gently. "I didn't do it for this," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "Anyone would have done the same." The dogs were brought in next, healthy now, coats shining, tails wagging. When they spotted Eleanor, both pulled eagerly toward her, ignoring commands until their handlers laughed and let them go. They pressed against her legs, just like that first morning. Tears blurred her vision. She knelt carefully, wrapping her arms around them. "I only kept you warm," she whispered. "You did the rest." The room went silent, many wiping their eyes, because everyone there understood the truth. Winter returned to the valley the following year, quieter than before. Snow dusted the trees, and smoke curled gently from Eleanor's chimney as she sat by the window, watching the world she thought had forgotten her. But it hadn't. Every few weeks, a familiar patrol car appeared at the end of her road. Sometimes it brought groceries, sometimes firewood, and sometimes it brought 2 special visitors. The dogs always arrived first. They bounded from the vehicle, strong and confident now, racing to the porch like it was theirs. Eleanor laughed every time, the sound lighter than it had been in years. They circled her, tails wagging, noses pressing into her coat, reminding her she was never truly alone. They stayed for hours lying by the fire, watching the door, standing guard like they always had. And when it was time to leave, one of them always hesitated, glancing back at her as if committing the moment to memory. Eleanor would kneel, resting her forehead gently against his. "Go on," she'd whisper. "They need you." And they would go, because loyalty doesn't fade. It multiplies. Eleanor returned to her quiet life, but something had changed. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt peaceful. Because kindness, once given, never truly ends. It echoes in paw prints in the snow, in lives saved, and in hearts forever connected. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story of compassion, courage, and loyalty.